All right, let's start. Number 12. The man they built a bunker to kill. In November 1942, the city of Stalingrad had been reduced to rubble by months of industrial slaughter, a landscape of collapsed factories and frozen corpses stretching to the horizon. Inside that ruin, a Soviet soldier named Vasily Zaytsev was making the German army afraid to move. He belonged to the 62nd Army, assigned to the Kollaa-adjacent urban front, and he operated with a patience that bordered on inhuman. He would lie still for hours in the debris, waiting for a helmet to rise above a parapet. By the time German commanders understood what they were dealing with, Finnish military records would eventually credit him with over 500 confirmed kills. Zaytsev had grown up hunting in the Ural Mountains, learning to track and wait in conditions that broke other men. That background shaped everything about how he fought. He used iron sights rather than a telescopic scope, believing the scope created a visual tunnel that narrowed his awareness of the battlefield around him. He trained other snipers in the same philosophy, passing his methods through a program that multiplied his lethality across the entire Soviet line. The 62nd Army understood that a single skilled sniper could paralyze an infantry unit far beyond his confirmed kills, because every soldier who could not see where the shots were coming from would stop moving entirely. The German High Command eventually concluded that Zaytsev was not a tactical nuisance, but a strategic problem. According to Soviet military accounts, they dispatched a senior instructor from the Berlin Sniper School, an officer Soviet records identify as Heinz Thorvald, to eliminate him. The operation was extraordinary. Sending a specialist across a theater of war to hunt a single soldier represented an acknowledgement that one man had become more dangerous than a company. For days, two of the finest marksmen of opposing armies moved through the same rubble, reading shadows, waiting for the other to make an error. Soviet accounts record that Zaytsev identified Thorvald's position by the glint of a rifle scope beneath a sheet of corrugated iron and killed him with a single shot. The scope recovered from the encounter is displayed at the Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow. It should be noted that German records do not independently corroborate Thorvald's identity or mission, and some historians treat the duel as partially mythologized. What the records do confirm is that the German counter-sniper operation failed, and Zaytsev continued fighting. He was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union on February 22, 1943. The legend outlasted the war, the Soviet Union, and Zaytsev himself, who died in 1991. But the question the legend raises has never been comfortably answered. If a single rifleman could compel an entire army to dedicate specialist resources to his elimination, what does that reveal about the relationship between individual human will and the vast, impersonal machinery of industrial war? Number 11. The deadliest woman in the history of war. In August 1942, a young Soviet soldier arrived in Washington, D.C. as part of a diplomatic delegation and faced a press conference full of American journalists. One of them asked whether she wore nail polish at the front. Another wondered aloud whether her uniform skirt was regulation length. Lyudmila Pavlichenko stood at the podium and waited for the questions to finish. She had 309 confirmed kills. She was, by any measurable standard, the most lethal female combatant in the documented history of warfare, and the journalists in that room had not yet understood who they were speaking to. Pavlichenko had been a history student at Kiev University when Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. She volunteered immediately, was assigned to the 25th Chapayev Rifle Division, and was deployed to the brutal defensive campaigns around Odessa and then Sevastopol. She was not placed in a support role. She requested frontline sniper assignment and was given it, operating in conditions where Soviet forces were consistently outnumbered and outgunned. The expectation for Soviet soldiers in those early campaigns was not victory. It was survival long enough to slow the German advance. Pavlichenko did considerably more than survive. Her 309 confirmed kills included 36 enemy snipers, a figure that matters more than it might seem. Killing a trained counter-sniper requires a different order of skill than engaging infantry. A sniper hunting a sniper understands concealment, patience, and the discipline to remain still past the point where the body demands movement. Each of those 36 represents an encounter where a highly trained opponent was hunting her at the same moment she was hunting them, and she was the one who came back. The German forces took her seriously enough to broadcast personal threats over loudspeakers and to direct artillery fire at her suspected positions. She was wounded 4 times during her combat service and was permanently withdrawn from frontline duty in 1942 following her 4th wound. The Soviet government then deployed her as a propaganda asset, which is how she ended up in Washington and later in Canada, on a tour intended to build Allied support. Eleanor Roosevelt personally invited her to the White House, making her the first Soviet citizen received there during the war. She was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union on October 25, 1943. She later completed her history degree and became a researcher at Soviet Naval Headquarters. The journalists who asked about her uniform and her nail polish did not publish notable follow-up pieces. There was nothing in the end that added usefully to the number 309. That figure required no embellishment, no context, no translation across cultural or political lines. It was the most precise thing anyone said in that room, and Pavlichenko had offered it without drama, because to her it was simply a record of work completed in a war that was still ongoing, and she had more important things to think about. Number 10. The most decorated officer nobody taught you about. On the afternoon of September 20th, 1944, soldiers of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, climbed into canvas assault boats on the south bank of the Waal River at Nijmegen in the Netherlands. The German defenders on the far bank had clear fields of fire across open water. The boats were not armored. Many of them were sinking before they reached the halfway point. First, Lieutenant James McGillis made it across, reached the far bank under direct fire, and began clearing German positions with the methodical ferocity that had already made him a decorated soldier before Operation Market Garden had even begun. McGillis had been fighting since the Italian campaign, where he served at the Anzio beachhead in early 1944, one of the most ferocious and attritional engagements American forces faced in the European theater. He had been decorated before the Wall crossing, and would be decorated again after it. His record across the entire war, from Italy through the Netherlands and into the Battle of the Bulge and the Rhineland campaign, would accumulate into something that regimental historians would eventually assess as the most extensive decoration file of any officer in the entire history of the 82nd Airborne Division. That is a unit that has produced extraordinary soldiers across more than 80 years of American military history. His decorations included the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, and 2 Purple Hearts, among others. What made his record unusual was not the presence of any single award, but the consistency of the conduct that produced them. Each decoration represents a separate verified incident, assessed by officers who were present, documented in after-action reports, and approved through a bureaucratic process designed to resist inflation. Taken together, they describe a soldier who repeatedly, across multiple campaigns and theaters, performed at the outer edge of what combat allows a person to do and survive. He published his memoir, titled All the Way to Berlin, in 2003, more than 5 decades after the war ended. By that point, the soldiers who had crossed the wall with him were mostly gone, and the operation itself was better remembered for its strategic failure than for the individual acts of extraordinary courage it contained. The crossing at Nijmegen is documented in historical accounts of Market Garden, but the names of the men who made it across in sinking canvas boats under machine gun fire rarely appear in popular histories of the war. McGillis died in 2020 at the age of 103. His record remained, at the time of his death, what it had always been: the most decorated officer in the history of one of America's most celebrated military units. The question is not whether that record deserved recognition. The question is why it took most people a century to notice it was there. Number 9. The only combat soldier to win the Victoria Cross twice. The Victoria Cross is the highest military honor in the British and Commonwealth Armed Forces. Since its creation in 1856, it has been awarded fewer than 1,400 times across all conflicts. To win it once places a soldier in extraordinarily rare company. 3 men in history have won it twice. Of those 3, only one earned both awards in direct, active combat, fighting on the ground against the enemy, in 2 separate theaters, in the same war. His name was Captain Charles Upham of the 20th Battalion, New Zealand 2nd Division, and the citation for his second award describes actions that his commanding officers struggled to explain in the formal language of military bureaucracy. Upham was a farmer and a musterer from Canterbury, New Zealand, not a professional soldier, and he had none of the polish that peacetime military service produces. What he had instead was a physical fearlessness that his fellow soldiers found somewhere between inspiring and alarming. He was deployed to the disastrous defense of Crete in May 1941, where German airborne forces overwhelmed the Allied garrison in one of the most chaotic campaigns of the early war. In those conditions, where coherent command had broken down and soldiers were fighting in improvised defensive positions across unfamiliar terrain, Upham distinguished himself with a consistency that the London Gazette citation dated 1941 documents in precise and almost incredulous detail. During the Crete fighting, he led attacks on German positions while suffering from dysentery so severe that he could barely stand. He carried wounded men under fire. He destroyed a German vehicle with grenades at close range and was himself wounded in the arm. His first Victoria Cross citation credits him with killing over 20 enemy soldiers across multiple engagements during the withdrawal. When he was eventually evacuated from Crete, his fellow soldiers assumed his war was effectively over. Instead, he returned to his unit and was deployed to North Africa. At Ruysat Ridge on July 14th and 15th, 1942, Upham led his company in an attack on heavily defended German positions. He was wounded twice during the assault, but continued fighting. He attacked enemy tanks on foot using grenades. He was finally captured only after being shot through both arms, leaving him physically unable to hold a weapon. The Germans, who had dealt with many prisoners of war, recognized something different in Upham and eventually transferred him to Colditz Castle, the fortress reserved for the most dangerous and escape-prone Allied officers, with a note classifying him as super dangerous. After the war, the people of New Zealand raised £10,000 for him as a gesture of national gratitude. Upham donated the entire sum to an agricultural scholarship fund. He returned to farming in Canterbury and declined most requests for interviews or public appearances. He died in 1994 at the age of 86. The man who had been classified as super dangerous by the German army wanted, more than anything else, to be left alone to work his land in peace. The war, it seems, had simply been a job that needed doing, and he had done it to a standard no one before or since has matched. Number 8. The teenage boy who jumped on 2 grenades. On February 20th, 1945, the second day of the American invasion of Iwo Jima, a 17-year-old boy named Jack Lucas was moving through a ravine with 3 other Marines when 2 Japanese grenades landed in the trench with them. Lucas had approximately 2 seconds. He did not run. He pulled both grenades beneath his body, shielded his 3 companions with his own frame, and absorbed the full force of both detonations. His Medal of Honor citation, issued by the United States government, records this as a deliberate act. He was, at the moment of that decision, not even supposed to be on the island. Lucas had enlisted in the Marine Corps at the age of 14 by forging his mother's signature on the parental consent form. He had trained, been assigned to a support role in Hawaii, and when it became clear he would not be deployed to combat, he went absent without leave, stowed away aboard the troopship USS Duel bound for Iwo Jima, and presented himself to an officer on arrival, apparently calculating that being sent into a beach assault was preferable to facing the consequences of desertion from a rear area post. The officer, facing an invasion, had more pressing concerns. Lucas was issued a rifle and ammunition, though he had not completed live-fire training. What the grenades did to him should have been fatal by any reasonable medical assessment. He absorbed the detonation of 2 anti-personnel grenades at contact range. Fragments, later estimated by surgeons at approximately 250 pieces of metal, were distributed throughout his body, in his arms, his chest, his legs, and his torso. One grenade had failed to fully detonate, which surgeons believed was the only reason his internal organs sustained survivable rather than catastrophic damage. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a naval hospital, and began what would become a sequence of 21 surgical procedures over the following years. Doctors who treated Lucas in the immediate aftermath of the engagement described his survival as medically difficult to account for. The distribution and quantity of fragmentation injuries he sustained were inconsistent with survival under standard clinical expectations. He was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Harry Truman and became the youngest recipient of that decoration in the Second World War. He later returned to the Marine Corps after his recovery, earned his parachute qualification, and in 1961 survived a skydiving accident in which both his primary and reserve parachutes failed to open. He hit the ground and walked away. Jack Lucas was 17 years old when he decided that his body was a more acceptable target for 2 grenades than the bodies of the 3 men beside him. There is no training protocol that produces that decision. There is no doctrine that requires it. In approximately 2 seconds, with no time for calculation or reflection, he made the most consequential choice of his life, and the sheer fact that it was not also his last choice remains one of the stranger puzzles in the medical and military history of the Pacific War. Number 7. The Viking who fought his own war. On the night of April 8, 1945, with the war in Europe less than 5 weeks from its end, Major Anders Lassen of the Special Air Service led a raid on German positions along the northern shore of Lake Comacchio in northern Italy. The operation required his unit to silence a series of enemy outposts to allow a larger Allied advance. Lassen's position came under intense fire early in the assault. His men began to take casualties. Rather than withdraw to a defensible position, Lassen attacked the first German outpost alone, silenced it, then moved forward and attacked the second, then the third. He was fatally wounded approaching the third position. He was 24 years old. Lassen was Danish, born in 1920 on the island of Funen, and had no formal obligation to fight in a British war. When Germany occupied Denmark in April 1940, he made his way to Britain and volunteered, eventually joining the Special Operations Executive and later the Special Air Service and Special Boat Service. He became one of the most audacious raiders Britain deployed across any theater. He operated in North Africa, across the Greek islands and the Aegean, in Albania, and finally in Italy, leading small unit actions against German and Italian positions that relied on speed, aggression, and a ferocious willingness to close with the enemy at distances where rifles became irrelevant. His preferred method of operation, documented across multiple after-action reports, and the regimental history of the SAS, involved approaching enemy positions at night with minimal equipment, relying on surprise and close-quarters violence rather than firepower and distance. His commanding officers, several of whom have gone on record in biographical accounts, found him extraordinarily difficult to manage, not because he was insubordinate in any conventional sense, but because his appetite for direct engagement consistently exceeded what they considered prudent risk. They attempted more than once to rotate him away from frontline operations. He consistently found his way back. By the time of Lake Comacchio, he had been awarded the Military Cross 3 times. 3 Military Crosses is a distinction without precedent for any soldier of any rank in the British Armed Forces. Each award requires a separate verified act of exceptional gallantry, assessed independently by senior officers and approved through formal channels. 3 separate times, the British military bureaucracy looked at what Lassen had done and concluded that its highest available non-commissioned decoration was the appropriate response. The Victoria Cross was awarded posthumously for the Lake Kamakyo operation. Anders Lassen is the only non-British Commonwealth national to have received the Victoria Cross while serving in British forces during the Second World War. That distinction is remarkable enough on its own, but the fuller measure of what he was is contained in those 3 military crosses awarded before he died, each one documenting a separate occasion on which a reviewing officer looked at the evidence and concluded that what Lassen had done exceeded the ordinary understanding of courage. He was awarded the Victoria Cross after he was dead, and it remains the only decoration large enough to account for what he left behind. Number 6. The man who accepted the surrender of 23,000 Germans. In the summer of 1944, somewhere in the massif central region of southern France, a Scottish officer in a clan kilt walked alone toward the lead elements of a German military column and informed the commanding general that Allied forces had the column completely surrounded. The officer was Captain Tommy McPherson of the Special Operations Executive, attached to the French resistance networks operating behind German lines following the Normandy landings. The Allied forces he described did not exist. The surrounding units were entirely fictional. The German general looked at the kilt, assessed the situation, and stood down approximately 23,000 soldiers. McPherson had reached that moment through a career that had already included being captured twice and escaping twice, which is itself a remarkable enough record. He had been taken prisoner during operations in North Africa, escaped, been recaptured in Italy, and escaped again before being inserted into France by the SOE to coordinate Maquis resistance activity in the south. The SOE's mission in France, following D-Day, was to disrupt German communications and logistics severely enough to prevent reinforcements from reaching Normandy in the critical early weeks of the Allied beachhead. McPherson wore his clan kilt deliberately, calculating that an officer in Highland dress represented something psychologically disorienting to German commanders accustomed to more conventional adversaries. His operations across southern France, coordinating Maquis sabotage of road and rail networks, are credited in SOE after-action assessments and subsequent historical analyses with delaying the movement of significant German forces toward the Normandy front. The figures most frequently cited in biographical accounts, including his own memoir, suggest his operations contributed to delaying approximately 50,000 German troops by as much as 2 weeks. Military historians examining the Normandy campaign have noted that the first weeks of the Allied beachhead represented the period of maximum vulnerability, when German armored reinforcement at the right moment could potentially have pushed the invasion back into the sea. He was decorated with the Military Cross and 2 bars, the French Croix de Guerre and the Légion d'honneur. The kilt was not an affectation. It was a carefully considered psychological instrument in the hands of a man who understood that war is as much about what the enemy believes as about what you can physically do to them. McPherson understood that a German general standing in a field in the south of France, confronted with a kilted Scotsman who appeared entirely unafraid, might find his confidence in the tactical situation considerably undermined. The figures McPherson's operations produced, 23,000 soldiers standing down, 50,000 delayed, remain attributed primarily to his own accounts and SOE records that have only been partially declassified. The precise numbers may be approximate. What cannot be approximate is the strategic reality they point toward. If the German forces that failed to reach Normandy in time had arrived 2 weeks earlier, the question of whether the Allied beachhead survived its most vulnerable period becomes uncomfortably open. How many battles were decided not by the armies that fought them, but by a single officer in a kilt, standing in a field, bluffing harder than anyone had a right to? Number 5. The one-eyed soldier who liberated a city alone. On the night of April 12th, 1945, Corporal Léo Major of the Fureur Bataillon, le Régiment de la Chaudière, 1st Canadian Army, was sent with a single partner to scout the German-occupied Dutch city of Zwolle. The mission was reconnaissance. His partner, Corporal Willie Arsenault, was killed shortly after they entered the city perimeter. Major, rather than withdrawing to report the situation, decided to continue alone. By dawn on April 13th, German forces had abandoned Zwolle entirely. Leo Major had liberated a city of approximately 50,000 people by himself, in one night, with one eye. The eye had been lost to a phosphorus grenade on June 6, 1944, during the D-Day landings in Normandy on the first day of his first engagement in combat. Medical officers recommended he be withdrawn from active service. Major refused. He argued, with a directness that appears to have been characteristic, that one eye was sufficient to sight a rifle, and that the army had his other eye's worth of work already on the books. He returned to his unit and continued fighting through the Normandy campaign, the Scheldt estuary battles, and into the Netherlands, accumulating a record that would eventually require his commanders to run out of ways to formally acknowledge what he kept doing. Inside Zwolle that night, Major moved through the German-held streets, raiding SS headquarters, freeing captured resistance members, and creating enough noise, confusion, and visible aggression that the German garrison commander concluded he was the leading element of a much larger force. The German forces withdrew across the Ijssel River before dawn, abandoning a city they had held for 5 years without a significant engagement. Major accomplished this without artillery support, without reinforcement, and without the operational advantage of surprise, since the German forces were aware that Allied troops were in the area and expecting an assault. The Distinguished Conduct Medal he received for the Zwolle action was his second. He had been offered a first DCM earlier in the campaign, and refused it, informing the relevant officer that he did not wish to receive a decoration signed by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whose conduct of operations he did not respect. This is a documented incident in Canadian military records, and it reflects something important about Major's character. He had a precise understanding of his own performance, and an equally precise indifference to the institutional approval of people he considered unworthy of the honor. He went on to serve in the Korean War, earning a second Distinguished Conduct Medal at the Battle of Kwangsan in 1951, making him one of the very few soldiers to earn that decoration in 2 separate conflicts. The city of Zwolle holds annual commemorations in his honor to this day, and a street bears his name. He liberated them alone in one night, with one working eye, and most of the world has never encountered his name. The city of Zwolle has not forgotten, even if everyone else did. Number 4. The White Death. On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union launched a full-scale invasion of Finland, with a force of more than 450,000 soldiers along a front stretching hundreds of kilometers. Finnish forces were outnumbered by ratios that military planners considered incompatible with organized resistance. On the Kollaa front, in the dense forests of Karelia, a 34-year-old farmer named Simo Heiha took up a position in the snow. He was assigned to the 6th Company, 34th Infantry Regiment of the Finnish Army. He carried an M28-30 bolt-action rifle. The temperature was minus 40 degrees Celsius. Over the next 98 days, Finnish military records credit him with more than 500 confirmed kills. Heiha had grown up in Rautjärvi, a rural district near the Soviet border, hunting and farming in conditions that most soldiers from industrialized countries would have found physiologically unendurable. He had completed his mandatory military service and then spent years in the local civil guard, developing the fieldcraft and patience that hunting in Finnish winter requires. When the war began, he was already intimately familiar with the terrain, the light conditions, the way snow behaves under different temperatures, and the psychology of waiting without moving for periods that defeat most human beings before they understand what they are attempting. He worked without a telescopic scope, using iron sights instead, because a telescopic sight requires a shooter to raise their head higher above the snowline to achieve the necessary eye relief. A lower profile meant a smaller silhouette. He packed snow with his breath into a compressed block in front of his muzzle to suppress the steam that breath produces in extreme cold, which could betray a position to an alert observer. He wore white camouflage over his uniform and moved at night to new firing positions, never repeating a location. The Soviet soldiers on the Kollaa front began calling him Bela Smrt, the White Death. The Soviet Army's response escalated from counter-sniper teams to artillery barrages directed at his estimated positions, to dedicated hunter-killer units assigned specifically to his elimination. None of it worked. On March 6, 1940, a Soviet soldier finally landed a shot that struck Heha in the left side of his face with an explosive bullet, destroying a significant portion of his jaw and leaving him unconscious in the snow. His fellow soldiers carried him back to Finnish lines. He was not expected to survive the wound. He regained consciousness on March 13, 1940. That date was the day the Winter War ended, the day Finland and the Soviet Union signed the Moscow Peace Treaty. He lived until 2002, dying at the age of 96 in a veterans' care home in Hamina. In interviews conducted in his later years, he was asked repeatedly how he had achieved what the records credited to him. His answer was consistent and brief. He said he did what he was told, as well as he could. 500 confirmed kills in 98 days, in temperatures that kill unprepared men within hours, against an army that dedicated specialist resources to his elimination. Simo Heha did what he was told. The Soviet army brought everything it had. It was not enough. Number 3. The most decorated American soldier in history. On January 26, 1945, near the village of Holtzwihr in the Colmar pocket of eastern France, 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, ordered his men to withdraw to the cover of the tree line. German forces were attacking in strength, supported by 6 Tiger tanks, and the American position was being overrun. Murphy sent his soldiers back, then climbed alone onto the deck of a burning M10 tank destroyer that had already taken a direct hit and was considered by everyone present to be at extreme risk of catastrophic ammunition detonation. He picked up the vehicle's .50 caliber machine gun and began firing at the advancing German infantry. Murphy had been trying to enlist since he was 15 years old, writing letters to military recruiters in the months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. When America entered the war, he was 17 and attempted to join the Marines, who rejected him for being underweight and too small. He tried the paratroopers, who turned him away for the same reasons. He eventually enlisted in the regular army, was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division, and fought through the campaigns in Sicily, Italy, and southern France before reaching the Colmar pocket in the brutal winter of 1944 to 1945. By January 1945, he had already been decorated multiple times. He had also lost most of his closest friends in combat, a fact documented in his autobiography and in the accounts of soldiers who served alongside him. At Holtzwihr, Murphy held his position on the burning tank destroyer for approximately an hour, fighting alone against an attacking force the Medal of Honor citation estimates at 250 soldiers. He called in artillery strikes by field telephone, at one point directing fire onto his own position because the German infantry had closed to within a distance that made any other adjustment insufficient. He was wounded in the leg during the engagement. When his ammunition ran out, he climbed down from the vehicle, reorganized his withdrawing men in the tree line, and led a counterattack that pushed the German force back. The tank destroyer did not explode while he was standing on it. The reason for this remains unclear. His complete decoration record at the end of the war comprised 33 individual awards, making him the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War. The list included the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star with Valor, 3 Purple Hearts, and numerous French and Belgian decorations. He was 20 years old when the war ended. Life magazine put him on its cover. Hollywood made a film of his autobiography. None of it appeared to give him much relief from what the war had done to him. Murphy slept for years with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He spoke publicly about the nightmares and the hypervigilance that followed him home from Europe, at a time when the American military and public culture had no adequate language for what he was describing. He became, in the end, one of the earliest and most prominent advocates for what would eventually be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The most decorated soldier in American history came home, put a weapon beside his bed, and spent the rest of his life trying to explain to a country that had celebrated him that the cost of what he had done was still being paid every single night in the dark. Number 2, the man who couldn't be killed. By the time Lieutenant General Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart retired from active military service, he had been shot through the skull. He had been shot through the face. He had been shot through the stomach, the ankle, the leg, the hip, and the ear, across 2 world wars and the Boer War before them. He had lost his left eye to a wound in 1914 and his left hand to a separate wound in 1915. He had survived 2 plane crashes, including one into the Mediterranean Sea from which he swam ashore. He had been held in an Italian prisoner of war camp and had escaped, been recaptured, and escaped again. He had walked more than 100 miles through enemy-held territory to reach Allied lines. He described his life in his 1950 memoir as frankly enjoyable. Carton de Wiart was born in Brussels in 1880, the son of a Belgian lawyer, and educated in England, which is where his relationship with the British military began. He served in the Second Boer War as a very young man and was wounded there. He then spent the pre-war years in the army, and when the First World War began, he threw himself into it with a relentlessness that alarmed even the Western Front's considerable appetite for dangerous soldiers. He fought at Ypres, at the Somme, and at Passchendaele, 3 of the most ferocious engagements in the history of warfare, and was decorated repeatedly. His Victoria Cross was awarded for his conduct at the Battle of La Boiselle on the Somme in July 1916, where he continued to lead attacks despite being wounded multiple times during a single action. A surgeon who treated one of his hand wounds in the First World War reportedly declined to amputate his fingers at a pace Carton de Wiart considered appropriate. Carton de Wiart's memoir records that he resolved the situation himself, pulling off the fingers in question with his remaining hand. This account is self-reported and cannot be independently corroborated from medical records. It is, however, entirely consistent with everything else the documented record reveals about him. When the Second World War began, he was nearly 60 years old. He was given a command in Norway, where the 1940 campaign was a disaster. He was then sent to Yugoslavia, where his plane crashed into the sea. He swam to the Libyan coast. After his capture and eventual release from Italian custody, Churchill deployed him as a personal envoy to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek in China, a role he held from 1943 onward. Winston Churchill wrote of him that he was indestructible. This was not hyperbole. It was a factual assessment from a man who had reviewed the documented record. Carton de Wiart had been assessed as mortally wounded, or as a likely fatality on multiple separate occasions by medical professionals examining his actual physical condition, and on each occasion he had recovered and returned to active duty. He died in his bed in County Cork, Ireland, in 1963, at the age of 83, having outlasted the Boer War, the First World War, the Second World War, and most of the men who served alongside him in any of them. The medical records of 3 wars across 4 decades do not produce an explanation. They produce only the accumulating evidence of a man who appeared to have some fundamental disagreement with the biological processes that end human life, and who pursued that disagreement with the same ferocious determination he brought to everything else. Carton de Wiart stands as a testament to what the records confirm and medicine cannot explain, but the soldier who follows him makes even that extraordinary account feel like a reasonable starting point. Number 1. The man who brought a sword to World War II. On December 27, 1941, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill stood at the bow of a British landing craft approaching the Norwegian port of Vågsøy in the gray light of a winter morning. Operation Archery, a combined operations raid on German positions in the port, was about to begin. Churchill was commanding the assault force. As the craft closed on the beach, he raised his bagpipes and began playing March of the Cameron Men. When the ramp dropped, he drew a Scottish broadsword, the weapon of a medieval Highland warrior, and led his commandos of No. 3 Commando directly into the German defensive positions. This is not a legend. It is documented in British Combined Operations after-action reports, witnessed by officers and men whose accounts have been independently corroborated. John Malcolm Thorpe. Fleming Churchill, decorated with the Distinguished Service Order and Bar and the Military Cross and Bar, had been, before the war, a professional archer, a newspaper editor in Burma, and a professional bagpiper. He had competed in the 1939 World Archery Championships in Oslo. He had appeared as an extra in period films, using his own collection of medieval weapons, because he owned medieval weapons. He believed and stated clearly on multiple occasions that the longbow was superior to the rifle for operations requiring silence, and he carried one into combat in France in 1940. He is the last British soldier documented to have killed an enemy combatant with a longbow in active warfare. He then went on to the commando raids, the bagpipes, and the sword, apparently concluding that the war had not yet offered him sufficient variety. In Sicily in 1943, Churchill led a night assault on the town of Molina, capturing an enemy observation post, and, according to accounts recorded in the regimental history and multiple biographical sources, taking 42 German prisoners and an entire mortar crew, using his broadsword as the primary instrument of persuasion. He held the view, which he expressed in several documented quotations, that any officer who went into action without his sword was improperly dressed. This was not bravado. He meant it as a practical assessment. The sword, in his analysis, was useful at close quarters in darkness, and he was frequently operating at close quarters in darkness. In 1944, while commanding a raid in Yugoslavia, Churchill was captured by German forces following an ambush. He was transported to Sachsenhausen concentration camp in Germany, a facility whose name in the history of that war carries a weight that stands apart from military analysis. He escaped from Sachsenhausen. He was recaptured in Austria. He escaped again. He walked, over the following weeks, more than 100 miles through enemy-held territory until he reached American forces in Italy. When he arrived, he learned that the United States had dropped atomic bombs on Japan and the war was over. He expressed disappointment, noting that if it had not been for those bombs, he felt he could have gone on indefinitely. Jack Churchill learned to surf in Australia after the war and is credited with introducing the sport to Britain. He competed in surfing competitions into his 60s. He died in 1996 at the age of 89, having fought a medieval war inside an industrial one, having survived capture by the regime responsible for some of the most systematic killing in human history, having escaped and walked out the other side, and having then taken up surfing. Every other soldier on this list was dangerous because of what they were willing to do. Jack Churchill was dangerous because of what he was willing to be, a man so completely himself, so entirely unconstrained by what the 20th century thought war should look like, that the war itself could not contain him. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.